Tonight, their doomsday dilemma. The residents inside eastern Aleppo have run out of time. The Syrian military telling them to decide now, surrender, or they will die. I'm Brent Goff, and this is The Day. This is one of the last pockets of rebel-held eastern Aleppo. The Syrian military is expected to take full control of the city at any time now, an imminent power reversal. Yet another trauma for a city that has come to know nothing else.
They even don't react when the explosion happens, which they lose their own resilience. So they are much more vulnerable to any harm, to any attack, because for them, war is normal. So we are talking about 500,000 of children who need really support, and more or less like 100,000 children need much more of special psychosocial assistance.
Tonight, we ask what happens after Aleppo. Is this the beginning of the end of the civil war? Well, welcome to the program, everyone. Donald Trump is not president yet, but he has already hung up, literally, on 40 years of U.S. foreign policy towards China and Taiwan. A phone call that some say the president-elect should have sent to voicemail. That's coming up later on in the show. We begin the day on the final day of the battle for Aleppo. The Syrian military says it is now in control of 98% of what was once the country's commercial capital. Pockets of rebel resistance in eastern Aleppo, according to the military, are expected to be defeated within hours tonight. Now, in the 5.5 years since the civil war began in Syria, the city of Aleppo has become synonymous with everything that could and has gone wrong for the people who live there. A nasty nexus of geopolitical power plays, international indifference and impotence, plus the constant threat of terror. And now the biggest defeat for the rebels becomes the strongest tailwind for President Bashar al-Assad. Make that the second strongest. Assad's ability to bombard Aleppo day in and day out was made possible by Russia. The Kremlin's support of the Syrian regime has made the difference, without question. Is that what Russians want? Our coverage starts tonight with the message from the battlefield and how it's received inside the living rooms and inside the minds of the Russian people.
In his weekly current affairs show, the head of Russia's state news agency, Dmitry Kiselyov, announced that the liberation of Aleppo was imminent and spoke of significant military gains. He said Russian soldiers were now providing food and water to Syrians who had until recently been used as human shields. Russian political scientist Dmitry Oreshkin says it's all part of an effort to convince Russians that Moscow is fighting a heroic war against the USA and the West, and that it is winning. The government is selling the liberation of Aleppo as a success. But what happens when the Russian troops leave? Assad's regime will not be able to hold on to these gains, so the troops will have to stay. Russia has been drawn into a trap. Getting in was easy, getting out will be complicated. The latest events in Palmyra seem to support Oreshkin's theory. Just last March, the recapture of the historic city was hailed as a significant victory against the so-called Islamic State. Today, Palmyra is once again in IS hands. Apparently, Syrian President Bashar Assad's army was too weak to hold on to the city by itself. Meanwhile, Russian state television is broadcasting the news that Assad will soon visit Aleppo and start rebuilding the city. Syrian journalist Nasser al-Youssef has lived in Russia for 30 years. He says the reporting on Russian television is extremely one-sided. Bashar al-Assad is portrayed as an educated and jovial ruler, and the rest as murderers and radical fundamentalists. He says the opposition is being ignored completely, and that Russia is making a huge mistake in giving all its support to Assad alone. As long as there's fighting, Russia will be able to pursue its own interests. But once it stops, it'll become clear that Russia has supported a criminal who murders his own people. Russia has been using the war in Syria to prove it is a major player, but the price is high. The military operation is already lasting longer than Russia's commanders had forecast, at a time when the country's economy is very weak.
Well, I'm joined now by our Middle East analyst, Daniel Gerlach. Daniel, it's good to have you here at the big table. Is the fall of Aleppo, is it a bigger win for Russia than for Assad?
That's a very difficult question. I don't think so. I think Russia has no illusion that the war is going to end with the fall of Aleppo, though they want to have it done. And they've said that before. Yeah. They have said that to Syrian opposition people, that the solution for Aleppo is going to be a Grozny solution, a Chechen solution. So one would just have to look at what President Putin, back at that time Prime Minister, incumbent president, was doing in Chechnya with Grozny. But the interesting aspect here is that from a Russian perspective, I think, there's still some optimism that on the ruins of Aleppo, as on the ruins of Grozny, you could build something new. And I wonder if that is only cynicism, or if that is really a political ideology that you think, destroy it, expel all the people from the ground, and then build something you call peace on the rubble. I'm baffled by it, but I think
have to be something that has no memory. Because I'll just read you something, a tweet from Ben Taub, a contributor at The New Yorker. He's tweeting that activists in Aleppo are tweeting out their final harrowing goodbyes. They will almost certainly be detained, tortured, killed upon capture. I mean, do we have any way of verifying that, of knowing? I asked earlier to someone on the ground in Syria, what will happen to people if they don't surrender in eastern Aleppo?
Well, you have those who don't surrender, but you also have those who simply don't want to leave.
Right.
Because they say, we've been through this for years. We have expected to die every day. We're still alive, but we're not going to move out. We're talking about those that can leave and don't, but we're also never talking about those that cannot leave. There's a lot of elderly people, for example, in eastern Aleppo, that cannot leave, or they just think it makes no sense anymore for them. What I think the scenario is going to be, the purpose of this campaign is not only to minimize casualties on the troop side by expelling everybody from the eastern part of the city, it is also to change the demography of Aleppo. And I think that is something that has been rarely understood to its full extent. What they think are going to do is they're going to try to filtrate the population, that's what the Russians also have done in Chechnya, by the way. You expel the population, then you separate the families from each other. You do investigations on young men that can potentially bear arms, and then probably you send some people back. But the most important thing is that you decide who is going to return to the city and who is going to live in what part of the city in the future. And that is the asset, which is
it's almost like an act of willful cleansing of a demographic in a way. Is this a day, I mean, if we're talking about today being, the end of Aleppo, is this a day that will go down in history as one of the greatest failures of humanity to help humanity?
Yeah, that's big words. Maybe politicians have said so. I don't know. I cannot compare the plight of people in Aleppo and the disaster of Aleppo to other disasters in the world. But what I think has become very clear, that the regime, with the help of its allies, could really take this to the end it wanted. And changing the demography of critical and strategic places, cities in the city for the future, was one of these goals. And to be honest, the regime never lied about it. It was buying a lot of time in the international negotiations, and Russia helped it with these efforts. But they never really denied what they were up to. And I think this could have been expected, and the international community could have known about it.
Yeah, I mean, earlier this year, the former UN Special Envoy to Syria, Lakhdar Brahimi, he said that the conflict, I'm quoting here, could have been resolved in 2012, but no one understood the situation well enough, and no one cared enough about the Syrian people. Is that
Yeah.
true?
I talked to Lakhdar Brahimi myself about this a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
And I think his approach is a bit too diplomatic, a bit too formalistic. At that time, 2012, we could think that Russia would intervene, but Russia wasn't taken seriously by any of the Western powers.
Exactly.
Russia was just seen as a power that is trying to gamble. But we had the Crimean crisis, we had Ukraine. And for Russia, it became a way to find a certain degree of eye level with the United States, and they succeeded in it. I think the crisis could have been solved in 2012, but or maybe even earlier. But throughout the years, the price for peace and the price for a ceasefire got higher and higher and higher. And at a certain point, the regime wasn't even expecting to win this back. I think they're not going to make peace. I think the war is not going to be over. But the regime has a good day today.
Is the disaster that is Aleppo, is it a direct result of Libya, Iraq, U.S. or in Afghanistan, these U.S.-led campaigns? Because the U.S. has not led a campaign in Syria, and many have said that this is the place where it should have been present.
The U.S. hasn't led a campaign there, but the U.S. has very clearly chosen allies, and these allies transformed. And the Syrian regime and its allies understood this game very well. How do you split the opposite camp? And how do you drive away the international powers? They've been doing this for their lives. For decades, they have been doing just that, playing international powers and
Playing chess.
Playing chess.
Yeah.
At the same time, fighting terror, fighting insurgency. They have been ready for that day. I mean, that's the essence of the regime's life, to be ready for the day of the insurgency. And I think the Syrian regime has been dramatically underestimated.
And there's a new UN Secretary General about to take office, and we've got a new U.S. president. Really briefly, will they be able to make a difference?
I don't think so. I think Donald Trump and his team have very clearly said that this is not a priority for them. With regard to the United Nations, I think it can't get any worse. So maybe it's going to be better.
Daniel Gerlach, as always, thanks for coming in. We appreciate your insights.
Thank you for having me.